When they finally reached the palace and the carriage slowed down, Shilian, Fengxian, and Muqing all breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. Shilian wiped away his cold sweat. The other two had been lashed by Qirong's whip a number of times, and their hands were covered in welts. Qirong rose to his feet, one leg stepping on the white horses behind. He proclaimed proudly, "What do you think, Cousin Crown Prince? I drive pretty well, right?" Shilian dismounted the carriage and replied, "I'm going to tell father and mother to confiscate your carriage." "What?" Qirong cried in shock. Regarding Xinla culture, first, they loved gold. Second, they loved precious stones. Third, they loved beauties. Fourth, they loved music. And fifth, they loved art. The palace of Xinla was thus the most distinguished place, where all that they loved coalesced. Traversing the large courtyard, walking down the crimson hallway, not everything was gilded or built of jade. There was also masterpiece paintings hung all around, for example, and soft music wafted in the air. It created the illusion of paradise. This palace was Shilian's home, the place where he grew up. Fengxian was chosen to be his personal guard at the age of 14, and had long since gotten used to these sights. However, it was Muqing's first time seeing such a building, and he couldn't help but be awed. Yet the more awed he was, the more careful he became, and the more he didn't dare to allow others to sense what he was feeling, didn't dare to take a wrong step. Shilian went to meet with the queen straight away. She was resting at Qifeng Palace, leaning on a small tea table and tasting new brews. She had already received the message that the crown prince had returned, and with eyes crescent-shaped in joy, she extended both arms before her son had even come near. She said, "Finally willing to come home and see your mom?" Fengxian and Muqing stood guard outside. Shilian entered the chamber with Qirong in tow, and he reached out to take his mother's hands when he approached. "Didn't I just visit 2 months ago?" The queen grumbled. "What a heartless child. Even Rong'er knows to keep an old woman like me company. But here you are, sounding all self-righteous when you haven't come home in 2 months. Shilian chuckled. "And how is mother old? You look no older than a teenager. It's like we're of the same generation." The queen was very pleased hearing those words of praise. Even if she had a son as old as Shilian, because of her status and wealth as a member of the noble Min clan and wife of the king of Xinla, she was very well maintained and still looked the part of a noble beauty. Still, the word that left her lips was a light astonishment. Flatterer. Shilian glanced at the small tea table and saw a jaded cup, its contents emitting a strange fragrance. He curiously asked, "What's this?" and he picked it up. But the queen warned, "Don't drink it. That's not something you should drink." Shilian was curious. "Why can't I drink this?" The queen reached for the small jaded cup and took it from him, poured a bit of its contents on her handkerchief, and pressed it gently to her face a few times. "Now Taihong recently sent a batch of fresh fruit. I don't like cherries, but there's a method of making them into paste for facials, so I squeezed some for fun. There's not much use for it, and I was about to have it thrown out, so you can't possibly drink it." Shilian smiled as he listened, but suddenly recalled the events of the previous day. There were very few times in a year when Muqing's mother could taste cherries, and Muqing himself was bullied for trying to pick some. It was something of a sensitive topic, and Shilian was afraid Muqing would be uncomfortable listening to it, so he smiled and changed the subjects. "Then do you have anything that I could eat?" The queen chuckled. "The way you make it sound, people will think I starve you. But you've been a picky eater since you were young. I can't plump you up. You've gotten so thin since you went to the mountain. Today you'll eat whatever I tell you to, with no fussing." Mother and son conversed for a while, and the queen asked about the incident during the heavenly procession with great concern. "By the state preceptor's report, it sounds serious. What's going to happen? Will you be punished?" Shilian didn't have the chance to answer before Qirong cut in. That wasn't Cousin Crown Prince's fault. He wasn't the one who fell off the wall. If anyone must be punished, it should be that little non-croaker." "What the heck is a little non-croaker?" Shilian thought. Before he could correct Qirong, however, the queen simply laughed. Then she happened to notice the two outside the manor and asked, "Who's the child next to Fengxian? It's the first time I've seen another person by your side." Shilian replied cheerfully, "That's Muqing. He's the one who played the demon on stage yesterday." Hearing this, anger flashed across Qirong's face. The queen said, "Really? Have him come in so I can see his face. Fengxian can come in too." Thus, Fengxian and Muqing entered the chamber and knelt before the queen. She took her time looking over Muqing and said to Shilian, "I thought he fought rather well yesterday. A fairly respectable child. Looking at his face, you'd think he'd be a gentle minister. No one would suspect he could be so tenacious while wielding a saber." Shilian grinned. "Right? I think he's quite good too." Qirong, on the other hand, commented coolly, "Oh, the demon yesterday was him?" Shilian heard his tone and felt dread. Sure enough, The next second, Qi-Rong suddenly exploded. He snatched the small jade cup from the little tea table and swung it right at Mu Qing's face. Here, your reward! Fortunately, Shilian was faster. He smacked Qi-Rong's hand, forcing him to drop the cup so the splash didn't make it to Mu Qing's face. Shilian pulled him back by the collar. Qi-Rong, what are you doing? Even as he was seized, Qi-Rong still ranted and raved. Cousin, I'm helping you discipline an impudent servant. Before you showed up yesterday, he sure was enjoying himself hogging the limelight. Who do you think you are? The star of the heavenly procession? Gonna overthrow the heavens too. The queen was stunned. Ronger, what are you doing? Mu Qing's face was spared the splash, but his clothes weren't. Because the queen hadn't given him leave to do otherwise, he stayed kneeling on the floor, his face ghastly pale and gloomy. Shilian passed Qi-Rong to Fengshen. Don't let him hit anyone. Fengshen only used one hand to restrain Qi-Rong, but Qi-Rong kicked and punched, spitting as he shouted, And who do you think you are to have the damn nerve to touch me so casually? Shilian could feel his head throbbing. Qi-Rong, you're getting more and more out of control. He then turned to the queen. Mother, I forgot to mention something. Please confiscate his golden carriage. Shocked, Qi-Rong yelled, No, why? That's Yimu's birthday gift to me. Even if it is, it must be confiscated, Shilian said. We almost caused a disturbance in the streets. You'd best not touch it again until you learn how to drive properly. The queen made a noise of surprise and asked, Disturbance? What disturbance? Shilian recounted the crazy saga of Qi-Rong's driving. Qi-Rong was furious, his eyes rimmed in red. Cousin Crown Prince is wrong! I didn't run over a single person! Shilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That's because we stopped you. Qi-Rong struggled out of Fengshen's hands and ran out of Qifeng Palace in a mad fit, not turning back even when the queen called out to him. She said helplessly, I'll talk to him tomorrow about confiscating his carriage. She sighed. That child has wanted a carriage for the longest time, so when his birthday came around and he still desperately wanted it, I gave it to him. Who knew it'd turn out like this? Had I known, I wouldn't have done it. Why must he have a carriage? Shilian wondered. He said it so he can go to Mount Taikong any time to bring you back to the palace, the queen replied. Shilian felt silent, learning that at the end of the day it was a gesture of goodwill. After a moment he spoke. It'd be better to instead find him a good teacher and restrain that temper. He can't keep going on like this. The queen sighed. And what teacher can restrain him? He only ever listens to you, and we could hardly have him go to the mountains to cultivate with you. The state preceptor would die before taking on him as a disciple. Shilian found the idea both hilarious and horrifying. He shook his head. With a temper like that, if he entered the royal holy temple, he would cause havoc for sure. Both mother and son were deeply troubled by this, but they didn't have any ideas, so they let it go for the time being. That evening, after having seen his parents and caught up, Shilian rose to leave the palace. It was a well-known fact that the crown prince was obsessed with cultivation. Ever since he entered the royal holy temple, he visited his parents less and less. The king didn't comment much on the matter, but the queen was always reluctant to see him go. After leaving the palace, Shilian casually strolled around the imperial capital, accompanied by Mu Qing, to visit his home as he'd suggested the day before. The tall, opulent red gates and the impoverished slums were only a street away from each other. Mu Qing's former home was tucked into a dark alley off the most bustling area of the imperial capital. The three of them had just turned into an alley when 5 or 6 children in rags surrounded them. Guga! Guga is back! Shilian was a little confused at first, wondering why they would call a stranger Guga. But then he discovered that the Guga they were calling to wasn't him, but rather Mu Qing. The children called out to him sweetly, but Mu Qing ignored them. There's nothing this time. Don't Guga me so easily. His face was wooden, but his voice wasn't cold. He turned to Shilian. Don't mind them, Your Highness. They're just kids from the block. Still, this group of children obviously knew him well, so they were clearly used to playing with him and weren't scared at all. They giggled and surrounded them, their dirty little hands extended, begging for treats from Mu Qing. In the end, Mu Qing reached for the gem-like red cherries in his bag and handed them out. Fengshen was astonished at this sight, as if Mu Qing doing anything like this was nothing short of a miracle. It was no wonder, since Mu Qing's pretty boy face always looked extremely selfish and cold-hearted. He seemed like the type that, seeing someone die from starvation on the streets, would still keep a tight grip on his own food. Shilian, on the other hand, wasn't surprised at all. At first, he also wanted to find something to give to the children, but he usually didn't carry sweets on his person, and having Fengshen give coins would be too much like dismissing beggars, so Shilian didn't think it would be appropriate. Suddenly there was a boom and a cacophony of galloping noises from the main street, the long, shrieking whinny of a horse and people screaming. The three of them stopped. Then Shilian rushed out of the alley. The main street was in chaos, stalls toppled and people on the ground. It was total confusion. The pedestrians were all fleeing, and red apples and yellow pears rolled all over the ground. But before he could figure out what was happening, he heard the crazed laughter of a young man. "Out of my way! Get out of my way! If you're that blind, I don't care if you get trampled!" Feng Shin swore. "It's Qirong again!" Sure enough, Qirong stood atop his magnificent golden carriage, looking malicious. He was lashing his whip wildly, the white horse howling from the strikes. "Stop him!" Shilian shouted. The golden carriage whooshed by them, and Feng Shin acknowledged with an "understood" before charging on ahead. Shilian was about to go check for any wounded among all the toppled stalls and knocked over pedestrians left in the wake of Qirong's mad ride, when suddenly he noticed something wrong. He whipped his head around and saw that there was something being dragged along behind the golden carriage, attached with a long, thick hemp rope. At the end of the rope was a large sack that appeared to have something struggling inside. It looked like there was a person in that sack. At that moment, Shilian could only feel his blood run cold. The next second he rushed forward. From all the whipping, that white horse was galloping like it was running for its life, furiously spinning the wheels of the carriage. Feng Shin was trying to hold the horse back, but probably wouldn't be able to stop it immediately. Shilian raced up to the carriage in only a few steps, unsheathed his sword, and struck down. The rope snapped in two, and the sack dropped to the ground, rolled, and came to a stop. Shilian bent forward to inspect it. The sack had been dragged for who knows how long, and was torn from the scraping. It was extremely dirty and drenched in blood. It looked like a bag for a dead body. Another swing from his sword, and the rope tied around the opening was cut. He opened the bag, and there was indeed someone inside. What's more, it was a young child. Shilian ripped open the entire sack. The child within was curled into a ball, hugging his head tightly. His filthy clothes were covered in giant footprints and fresh blood. Even his hair was matted with blood. He was a mess, and it was obvious he had been severely beaten, so badly that he didn't even look human anymore. Judging by his size, he was only 7 or 8, a tiny creature. He was shaking like a layer of his skin had been forcibly peeled off. Truly incredible that he was still alive after such a violent beating and being dragged through the streets. Shilian reached out a hand to feel his neck and found that his pulse wasn't too weak. He breathed a sigh of relief. He immediately picked up that small body, then turned around and barked a furious order. "Feng Shin! Arrest Qirong!" He could not believe that something like this could happen in the kingdom of Shinla. Under the light of day, on the main street, a member of the nobility stuffed a live human in a sack to be dragged behind a horse carriage. If he hadn't seen it and stopped it, this small child would have been dragged to death this day. From some distance away came the sound of whinnying and the angry roars of Qirong, and soon after, Feng Shin yelled back, "He's been stopped!" Shilian rushed toward them, just in time to hear Qirong howl in rage. "You damn audacious lowly servant! You dare hurt me? Who gave you the balls?" Turned out Feng Shin couldn't stop the horse, so he tried to snatch the reins instead. Of course, Qirong wouldn't let him. So the two pulled back and forth, and in a moment of carelessness, Feng Shin bumped him and pushed him off the carriage. Qirong fell to the ground and rolled a few times, scraping his knees. Seeing that he was surrounded by onlookers, he felt nothing but rage and embarrassment. However, Shilian cut in. "I did!" Qirong opened and closed his mouth a couple of times before finally crying, "Cousin Crown Prince!" Shilian said angrily, "Look at what you've done! Qirong, really!" Just then, he felt the child in his arms jerk. He had loosened the hands hugging his head and was peeking up at Shilian from the gap between his elbows. Shilian immediately restrained his anger and lowered his head to soothe him in a gentle voice. "How do you feel? Do you feel pain anywhere especially?" The child was amazingly still alert, not unconscious from pain, not frozen in shock. He shook his head. Shilian noticed that what little of his face was visible was bleeding, and he was about to check for other head injuries, but the child firmly clutched half his face with his hands, stubbornly refusing to show him. Shilian coaxed, "Don't be afraid. Everything's fine. I only want to check your injuries." The child, however, pressed his hands down harder, revealing only one large obsidian eye, looking panicked. But this panic didn't seem like it stemmed from a fear that he would get beaten, but rather that something would be discovered. Looking at this little face, half covered with only one eye to be seen, Shilian suddenly realized that he might have seen this child somewhere. He squinted as he thought. Chi-Rong saw his upset face and explained, "Cousin Crown Prince, that little non-croaker ruined your grand ceremony yesterday, so I avenged you. Don't worry, I was careful. He won't die." Sure enough, the child held in his arms was the one who fell from the city wall during the Shengyuan heavenly ceremonial procession the day before. No wonder Shilian thought he looked familiar. This little child hadn't even changed. He was still wearing the same outfit as the day before, but because of all the beating and dragging, he was filthier, and the clothes looked nothing like they had yesterday. He didn't even look like the same person. Shilian couldn't hold back his anger anymore. "Who told you to avenge me? It has nothing to do with this child. It wasn't his fault." Chi-Rong justified. "Of course it's his fault. If not for him, you wouldn't have been scolded by the state preceptor." This ruckus was getting out of hand, and the crowd watching was growing, the onlookers whispering to each other. Just then Muqing approached, and Chi-Rong pointed his whip at him, expression laced with hostility. "And you, lowly servant! I can tell this one doesn't know his place just from the look of him. If you don't discipline him, sooner or later he's going to overthrow you and step on you, his master. I helped you discipline him, but you turned around and defended him instead and told on me too. Now Yifu and Yimu are not only ignoring that I did it for you, they're even going to confiscate my golden carriage. Cousin, that was my birthday gift. I've wanted it for over 2 years." Muqing gave Chi-Rong an unreadable, sweeping look. Shilian laughed from sheer rage. "I don't need your help. Not like this. Are you really avenging me, or are you avenging yourself?" "Cousin, why would you say that to me?" Chi-Rong asked, confused. "And what have I done wrong? And what have I done wrong in being on your side?" Shilian couldn't talk sense with him. "Chi-Rong, listen here. From now on, you're not allowed to touch this child. Not even a finger. Do you hear me?" Just then, Shilian felt a pull on his neck. He was wrapped up in a fit of anger, so it startled him. He looked down and saw that young child had buried his face in his chest, his arms tightly circled around Shilian's neck. Shilian felt him shake uncontrollably and thought he was in pain. He hurriedly asked, "What's wrong?" The child was covered all over in mud, grime, and blood, filthy and unkempt. It all smeared onto Shilian's right robe, but Shilian didn't mind at all. He gently patted the child's back to comfort him, and soothed in a low voice, "I'll take you to the doctor's right now." The child didn't respond, but he hugged Shilian even tighter. He held on with a death grip and wouldn't let go, as if he were holding on to a lifeline. Chi-Rong could see that Shilian wasn't going to acknowledge his goodwill, his heart solely with outsiders. And when he saw that kid sullying Shilian's robes with bloody, muddy smears, his anger flared. He raised the whip to lash the back of the child's head. Fengshin was standing to the side, and in a split second, his leg flew out and kicked Chi-Rong right on the arm. There was a loud crack, and Chi-Rong screamed. The whip fell to the ground, and his right arm dropped limply at an abnormal angle. He stood there, frozen in disbelief, and it was a while before he slowly raised his head, glaring at Fengshin, enunciating each word. "You dare break my arm?"